Do you know that men and women are different? When it comes to emotion, women can be like a 64 pack of crayons, and men are stuck with the 3 pack of primary colors, right? Men color with 3 emotions, right? Happy, sad, angry. That's all we get. But we color with red, blue, yellow, and that's it. But women have nuance. There's not just blue and green, there's blue-green and aqua and turquoise, whatever that is. There's not just sad or happy, there's anxious, there's hopeful, there's happy crying, which makes no sense to me. Now, I'm generalizing, not necessarily because I agree with it, but because that's what our culture largely allows, right? It's getting a little better. In the modern world, men are allowed to feel their feelings a little bit more than they used to, but for a long time, this is what we were taught, right? Men do not feel, no nuance. And so what we find in all people, but particularly in men, is that sometimes the nuance of emotion comes out as anger. I might be stressed or scared or sad, but I don't know how to express that, so I just get angry. That's my blanket answer for everything. I don't have those colors in my emotional toolkit, so it always ends up looking like anger. Have you ever had that experience where you think you're mad about something and you're yelling at someone or you're fighting with someone, and then you realize you're not actually mad at them? Maybe you're sad or something else. You unpack it and you discover that there's another feeling. I've seen it a lot lately, and I have felt it a lot, thinking about the protocol and the stuff that's going on with our church, the good and the bad, the possible changes to our denomination. And I'm hopeful, I'm sad, I'm excited, and a lot of times I'm scared. And I think a lot of people are scared. And fear, like I said last week, makes us do dumb things. And I think that fear can make us act out in different ways, whether we mean to or not. I've seen people who pick a fight with someone on the other side. They just start yelling and fighting with them, and I don't think they're actually angry. I think they're sad about what's coming. Or I've also seen people who make big sweeping statements about the other side, whatever the other side means to you, right? And they make big sweeping statements, stuff that they know is not true, but they say it because it makes them feel better, because they're actually scared. Today is the last week in our sermon series called Old Testament Stories of Trust. We've been looking at these stories in the Old Testament to see that God is worthy of trust. It's a well-placed sermon series. I put it in the calendar 10 months ago, but God knew we needed it today. For all the anger and fear and sadness and hope that we are feeling in our denomination, in our church life, in our personal life, what I want to show you today is that trusting God is the secret to finally finding peace in your life. Now, this idea, these feelings that we are going through in the modern world, they're not new things. We've actually been going through these emotions over and over for thousands of years, stretching all the way back to our scripture story for today, the story of Gideon. Now, slowly through this sermon series, we've been working our way through the Old Testament, right? We started with the story of Noah, like way back at the beginning of the world, right? And then we fast forwarded up to Israel. We talked about the Israelites wandering in the desert and the story of Rahab right when they were about to attack Jericho. And now today, our story comes a little bit later in their story. And so we see Israel goes into the promised land, and they have no king. They have no leader at all. They don't have a leader to their people. What would happen is that the nation of Israel, when they would get in trouble, a single hero would rise up from the common people. He would get them through the crisis, and then he would let go of his power and go home, go back to his farm or whatever it was. These people were called judges. Now, this is before they came up with the idea of kings. Before they had kings, they had judges, which is why the book of Judges comes before the book of Kings. It's simple, right? Now, Gideon was a leader to his people Israel. He was a judge. Now, to give a little backdrop, our passage is chapter 7, but we introduce Gideon in chapter 6. And right at the beginning of chapter 6, Israel does what is evil in the eyes of God. And so God lets the Midianites conquer Israel. And so for about 7 years, Israel's been living under conquest. They've been oppressed by the Midianites, and God is finally ready to set Israel free, to let them go. And so he comes to Gideon in chapter 6, verse 12, and he says, He says, and an angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, the Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor. And Gideon said to him, please, my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his wonderful deeds that our fathers recounted to us, saying, did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and given us into the hand of Midian. So an angel of God shows up and says, God is with you. And Gideon's response is, where? Show me where God is with us. We've been living under oppression for 7 years. This bad stuff has been happening in our life. I don't think God is with us. I don't trust you. I don't believe you. And so then in verse 14, this says, and the Lord turned to him and said, go in this might of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Do not I send you? So it's like the angel comes to Gideon, and Gideon he says, God is with you. And Gideon says, no, he's not. Show me where God is with me. And so God turns to him and says, all right, fine, do it yourself. You go you go free yourself from Midian in your hand, in your might. And then in verse 15, we get to watch Gideon do a little backpedaling. He says to him, please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the smallest, the least of my father's house. Can you hear him like, whoa, no. I can't do that. I can't save Israel. And I never realized it until I was preparing for this sermon, but Gideon is kind of this complex character. He starts out doubting God is with them. They've experienced 7 years of oppression and decline, and because of the bad that they have experienced in his life, he doesn't trust God anymore. Even though God has done all these epic things in Israel's history, in the recent history, bad things have happened. And so now he doesn't trust God. He's like, I don't know if you're really for me. Have we ever felt that in our lives? Where some of the bad things that have happened more recently kind of blot out all the good things that he has done for us? And we're like, God, I don't know if I trust you. And Gideon, he's like this complicated character that I resonate with a lot. I was like, wow, Gideon, I didn't realize you and I were like brothers here. And so Gideon, he turns to God. He's like, look, I need a symbol. I need a sign. You got to show me. You have to give me some evidence that you really are still with us. And so God gives him a sign in the middle of chapter 6. And so then he gives Gideon some instructions. And he says, all right, I've given you a sign. Now you have to do something for me. I want you to go into the temple where they built a big altar to this false god, the Midianite god. And I want you to rip that altar apart and use the wood to build a sacrificial altar to me, the real God. He's like, all right, so I showed you some evidence. I showed you a sign. Now I want you to obey. I want you to follow me. And so Gideon, in verse 27, it says, so Gideon took 10 men of his servants, and he did as the Lord told him. But because he was too afraid of his family and the men of the town to do it by day, he did it by night. And so Gideon, I don't trust you. I don't know you. I don't believe that you're really for us. God gives him a sign and says, okay, now will you obey me? Will you follow me? And Gideon says, sure, I'll obey you, but at night. I'm going to sneak it in. He doesn't have that trust. He still doesn't believe in God. He still doesn't have that trust relationship. And so then we get into kind of a really strange story. Gideon takes a fleece blanket at the end of chapter 6, and he puts it on the ground. It's just a square of blanket that he puts on the ground. And he says, all right, God, here's what I want you to do. Tonight, in the morning, I want it to be that the blanket is wet, but the ground is dry. And the next morning he wakes up and the ground is dry and the blanket is soaking. It says he picks up the blanket and wrings it out and the water falls on the dry ground. And Gideon says, all right, cool, very done, very well done, very well done. All right, and then he puts the blanket down again and he says, okay, this time I want the blanket to be dry and the ground to be wet. And the next morning, that's what happens. The blanket is dry and the ground is soaking wet. And then that's the end of chapter 6. And then we get to our story in chapter 7. But do you see this? Gideon's making God hop through these hoops, right? Prove that you are worthy. Prove that I can trust you. Prove that you are good enough for me to worship, right? Prove this. And God's kind of doing it. He's hopping through these hoops. And then we get to our scripture lesson in chapter 7, and Gideon is at the head of his army. 32,000 men are ready to fight the Midianite army, which I should mention is 120,000 people. That's the army that we're about to fight is 120,000 people. And God looks at Gideon's 32,000 people, and he says, oh, whoa. Absolutely not. We're going to do this my way. Okay, you have way too many men. Now, personally, I'm looking at 32,000 versus 120,000. I'm not thinking he has too many people. But God says, you have way too many people. You're making me jump through all these hoops. We played with your blankie, and you still don't trust me. Right? You still don't trust me, so I need to prove to you that this is my action. All right? I will not let you think you did this. This is going to be my action. And so he says, you have way too many men. You might think this was your doing. And so God tells Gideon, you got to reduce your numbers. And anybody who is, and so he says, get up in front of your people and tell them, anyone who is scared, you can go home. And so Gideon gets up in front of his 32,000 men and he says, anyone who is scared, you can go home. And 22,000 men go home. Over 2/3 of the army was there, even though they had fear in their hearts. And this is totally an offshoot. This is not in the sermon, but I got to thinking this past week about our armed forces. And I wonder how many of them are scared, but they're still there fighting for our freedoms. And I kind of had this moment of like, wow, these brave men and women who are standing up even though they're afraid. And I just thought that was incredible. And so God releases those 22,000 people. And he's got 10,000 people left. And God says, no, that's still too many people. You still might think that it was you. You have too many people. Everybody go get a drink. Go down to the river and get a drink. And there's two types of guys. It says men who lapped it with their tongue, which is like the guys who like scooped the water and drank it like that, right? Or the guys who plunged their head into the river. And he said, if you stuck your face in the river, go home. And and there's only 300 men left. Apparently a lot of them were really hot that day. They all stuck their head in the water. So he has 300 men. Gideon started with 32,000 men, and he ends with 300 men to take on the Midianites. If you want to do the math, that's less than 1% of his original army. He has less than 1% to take on the Midianites, who we might remember are 120,000 strong. They describe them as locusts of abundance. They are like sand on the seashore. There's so many Midianites. And then there's this weird bit in verse 9 where God tells Gideon, hey, go down to the Midianite camp and just eavesdrop a little bit. It says in verse 10, but if you are afraid to go down to the camp with Purah your servant, and you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hand shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. And then he went down with Purah his servant to the outpost of the armed men who were in the camp. And so God sends Gideon to eavesdrop, to hear what they say, because he knows that will make Gideon feel better. Every step of the way, God is like reassuring Gideon, I'm with you every step of the way. I'm with you in this, but it's going to be my action. So Gideon overhears the Midianites talking about how scared they are of the Israelites, and God sent him to make him feel better. And so now Gideon is ready for an attack. And he gathers up his 300 men, and they surround the Midianite camp. And every guy has a trumpet and a clay jar. At Gideon's signal, they blow the trumpet, yell, smash the clay jar, which reveals the torches that were hidden inside the clay jars. And it's just chaos in the Midianite camp. I mean, if you can imagine, you hear trumpets and screaming and shattering pottery, and suddenly you're surrounded by fire. And the Midianite camp descends into chaos as the soldiers begin to attack each other. And it says in verse 20, it says, every man stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran, and they cried out and fled. And when they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against the army. And the army fled as far as Beth Shittah towards Zerahah, as far as the border of Abel Meholah by Tabbath. I don't know where any of those places are. God, 300 men with trumpets, defeated an army of 120,000 without drawing a weapon. And if you look at the way it's structured, I mean, there's no way Gideon could say, it was all me, I did it, we did it, hooray. This is absolutely God's victory. 300 men versus 120,000. So let's circle back to our original question. What if I don't have enough? The truth is, in this life, you don't have enough. You will never have enough. There is always more. There's always another level. You can give everything you've got in life, and still the world will want more from you. In life, it's never enough. The good news this morning is that trusting God is the only way that you can have enough in life. Without God, there will always be a need for more. When God showed up, he had 32,000 soldiers to take on 120,000. That's already insane, right? No way Israel defeats a force that's 4 times their size. And then God comes in, and what did he say? Get rid of them. Get rid of the soldiers. Get rid of 99% of your soldiers. Because I want you to realize you'll never have enough. But with me, it's not about that. I will always have enough for you. And this shows us something very important, that God is the source. God is the reason. He is the foundation of our lives. If you build your house on the wrong foundation, it will implode on itself. But if you build on God, you can stand strong. Love of God should be the root of everything we do. Now, there's nothing wrong with building on a foundation, but don't forget the foundation. Don't forget that God is there. God is the starting point of everything we do in life. We've got to learn to lean on God, to trust God. Don't trust in our own efforts. You see, God knows something very important about humanity. We have a tendency to think that we are awesome. We have a tendency to take the credit for everything, right? We take a good thing like confidence and we turn it into like arrogance. You know, we take self-affirmation and we turn it into self-absorption. We take a small victory and suddenly we claim we don't need God anymore. Think about this. In the last couple 100 years alone, we have had all these incredible, amazing medical achievements. And one of the first things we did as a medical community was cut God out of the picture and act like we didn't need him anymore. We cut God out of the picture. We started taking credit for everything. We still blame God for all the bad stuff, right? But surgeries and technologies and medicines and pills and vaccines, we think that's all us. We have forgotten the foundation. We get so excited about the things that we can do that we forget where we come from, where we get it all from. But God designed the story of Gideon to prove without a doubt who was in charge. God is the source of life, the foundation of existence. For Christians, trusting God is not optional. We have to trust God. To live in this world, you have to lean on something. And if you lean on yourself, you'll crumble. But we need to learn to trust in God instead. A lot of people that I bump into, they say, I just wish God would speak to me. I wish God would guide me in my life. I just want to hear from God. But the reality is, God is speaking to you. God is speaking to you right now in those moments when we are uncertain, when life has forced us to our knees, when we hit rock bottom. That's when we begin to listen. And so people seem to think that God only speaks when we're at rock bottom. But the truth is, God has been talking the entire time. I think we only started listening once we got to rock bottom. But you don't have to wait that long. So take a look at your life. Trusting God begins with opening your eyes. Take a look at your life with heaven's eyes. Try to see what God sees in your life. God is speaking. Are you listening? How do you listen to God? How does God speak to us? Well, there's a lot of ways, right? Sometimes he speaks through the words of a friend or a sermon. Sometimes it's in the things that we study in the Bible. Sometimes it's a snatch of words that we hear in a song on the radio. There's no limit to how God communicates to us. The only limitation in our connection to God is how much we are listening. God listens. God speaks. Are you listening? How close are we paying attention? So this week, the challenge is simple. Start listening to God. Ask God to show you how to read the signs that he has put in your life, to hear God's message, to remember your foundation. I truly believe that God speaks to each of us differently. All we have to do is start listening. When you start listening for God in your life, you're going to hear one message over and over and over. Trust me. That's what God is saying to us over and over. Trust me. Look at the story of Gideon. All the weird stuff that happens, the message of every moment is simply trust me. Make the blanket wet. Make the blanket dry. Get rid of 99% of your soldiers. Every movement and every moment is saying trust me. Don't trust in yourself. Trust God. So let's ask the question. If we give everything to God, and we learn to trust God, what does it look like in our life? The answer is really amazing. Trusting God is the path to finding peace in your heart. Let me say that again. Trusting God is the path to finding peace in your heart. When you are, how do I say this? When we trust God, we can learn to leave it in His hands. We can find peace. And there's 3 levels to this. First, we find peace in our heart. When the fear and stress and anger rises up in our lives, trusting God is one of the most effective ways to let go. If you know with confidence that at the end of the day, God will be there, it's so much easier to let go. Everything that happens in life can be used by God for His glory and for our good in this life or the next. So if we trust God, there will be peace in your heart. Next, there will be peace in your relationships. A lot of times it's the people around us that are causing some of that stress and anger and frustration. And so if we can find peace in our hearts, we can find peace in our relationships. Not right away, but eventually. As we trust God, as we grow closer to God and we learn to trust Him, He will show us how to heal the relationships in our life. Peace in our heart, peace in our relationships, and then lastly, peace in our actions in the world. If we remember that at the end of the day, God is the one that's in control, God is trustworthy, we can move forward into the future no matter what comes. Take the protocol, for example. The future of our denomination. It seems like such a big deal, doesn't it? It's like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? There's so much stress and fear and anger and sadness all coming together with this protocol. But here's the thing. I have this sneaky suspicion that God doesn't care that much about what name is on the outside of the building. I have this weird thing. I don't think God stays up late at night worrying about the lines that we decide to draw in this world. I don't think He cares. I think He cares a lot about how we treat each other, about whether we're loving God and loving our neighbor and loving our enemies the way He has taught us. I think that He cares about a lot. Think about this. Even if we fail, whatever failure looks like on whatever side you are on, God can still use that failure for His glory and for His good. Now, we still need to work hard, of course. But we can have confidence to know that at the end of the story, God wins. Whatever comes, God is the one who is in control, so we don't have to worry. I guess what I'm trying to say, this is like my core message of this whole sermon. We're almost done. All the stress that you're carrying around in your life is an unnecessary burden. You don't have to carry it. You can if you want, but I got a better idea. We could trust God. Take it off your shoulders, put it at the foot of the cross, and give it to God. Trust God. Let go of your burdens and find peace. Every week of this sermon series, we have asked a question for the last 4 weeks. We started with, what if I don't know how? And we realized, what if I'm not the best? And we realized you're not the best, but God is. And then we asked, what if you make mistakes? And we realized, yeah, you're going to make mistakes, but God doesn't make mistakes. And the third question was, what if I am overwhelmed in life? And it's like, yeah, you're going to be overwhelmed, but God is always going to be with you. And then today we ask, what if I don't have enough? And the answer is, well, God is always more than enough. Do you see how the answer to every question is God? It's all about trusting God. When we don't know how to do something, God does. When we make mistakes, God is there taking the broken pieces and healing them, breaking them better than they ever were. When we are overwhelmed, God is there to get us through. When we are not enough, God is overflowing. When we lean on ourselves, we're going to fall short over and over, and it's exhausting. But if we lean on God, you can find the path to peace in your life. And having that peace in your heart will help us remember how to love each other. Because I think maybe we forgot. So I'll leave you with this. May you trust God. When it feels like you don't have enough, learn to lean on God and not on yourself. And in that way, may you find peace. And when you have found peace, may you remember how to love each other. Amen.